to another episode of the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm your host, Ash Couchman, and I cannot wait to find moments of joy with you today. Look, myself and the guests that I've had on all week, we are two chatty gals, so we're going to dive straight into the episode. Let's get ready to hear today's words to live by.
For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11, NIV.
Kylie, it's so nice to hang out with you again.
So nice to be here,
Oh my
Ash.
goodness. This whole afternoon that we've been recording, and even when I spoke to you the other day, we just realized that we're very similar in many ways. We're both like elder sisters. We have a bit of a perfectionist tendency about us. And the funniest thing about that is this whole time, it's just you and I going, Kylie, you're amazing. and then Kylie like, Ashley, you're amazing. I'm like, but you're even better. And
but you really are amazing,
on top
Ash.
of that, us going, we can be quite self-critical, I find. And we've even spoken about it in the last kind of few moments. And just reminding ourselves, it's okay to not be perfect all the time. It's okay to allow God to use us and it not be, what's the word? Perfectly curated all the time. I think sometimes we feel like we have to show up to a level in order for it to be valid or worth it. But actually, it's just about showing up, and God uses you when you show up.
I just love that so much, Ash. And can I just say, you are the greatest encourager. Oh. You are such an amazing encourager. And as an encourager, it's such a beautiful gift to receive encouragement. And the second thing is I love how genuine we can be and that I've felt safe to express. This is a new experience. I've never been in a studio doing a podcast before.
Yeah. It can be intimidating when you step into a new space, or even just being new at something. I was just sharing before, doing new things in my role and going live on air and all these things. It can be intimidating. And
absolutely. And
to be honest, it kind of relates to our verse today. I think that the enemy often will try to intimidate us in the things that he's called us for. So this verse, it says, I know the plans that I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And I know for me, the enemy has tried to attack the things that God has had a future for me in for such a long time. And I want to dive into your story, but just as we've spoken about it, it reminded me, growing up, I've been so deeply insecure, and I've done episodes on it and we've talked about it.
Yeah.
And it's something that, I'm still working on. We're all still working on. I don't know, when there'll be that point where I'm like, I love everything that God has created me to be. And it's such a journey to go on. But something that I look at, and when I look back at my life, and why this verse kind of makes me think about is, if I had listened to every lie that I had heard or thought in my head that the enemy had put in, I wouldn't be where I am today. My fears, my insecurities were about my ability to talk and speak. I remember having panic attacks in like primary school and high school, having to do, have to do like speeches and stuff for English. That was my least favorite thing. I would shake, I would throw up, I would literally feel so anxious about doing anything that was like presenting. But like I could get on a stage and perform, but presenting and like actually being authentic and showing myself and my vulnerabilities, like that was something that I struggled with. And so I think, don't ever
and look at you now.
Well, that's exactly what I mean, right? That the Lord knows the plans and he leads us down that path. But sometimes I think the enemy tries to scare us and intimidate us. But it's kind of alongside our verse today, but kind of to the side. What do you think when you first read this, Kylie?
Well, firstly, I just want to say, I think it's great that you've acknowledged the spiritual battle, because we can actually forget that we are in a spiritual battle.
Yeah.
And we are battling Satan, basically, and he just wants to come in and rob us. Actually, John 10:10, the thief only comes to steal, kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And I love that, that sort of ties in with today's verse, that God knows the plans that he has for us, and those plans are to prosper us and not to harm us, and to give us hope and to give us a future. And it actually reminds me of the Romans 8:28 verse. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. This verse just reminds me that God's thoughts to us are always full of peace and hope and the future. a blessing. He would never wish ill on his kids, and anything against that is from the enemy. For me, I just find this such a comforting verse, and I think for all of us and anyone listening that might be facing difficult situations, that if you look at the scripture, it doesn't necessarily say that he promises to immediately rescue us from our situation, but that he has a plan for our lives regardless of that situation. That's what I love about this scripture. We might not see it in the natural, but that's where the hope comes in. And I think that's linked to trust, because we are actually trusting that God is taking care of it. And and he plans to give us the future that we hope for.
Yeah. This verse is so funny. I grew up watching the Soul Surfer movie. Do you know the Soul Surfer movie with Bethany Hamilton? I grew up watching that movie, and I was
How
obsessed.
amazing is she?
Oh my goodness, she's amazing. But this verse is something that I learned from watching that movie, because she kind of said that was a life verse for her, you know, going through that extremely crazy experience and trusting that, you know, the Lord had plans for her, even when something as crazy as what happened to her happened. And so it's such a good reminder for us that even in the presence of trouble, even in the presence of struggle, it doesn't mean that God doesn't have plans. It doesn't mean he's abandoned his plans on us.
That's so good.
And I think it's such a great reminder that if things don't always go the way we planned, it doesn't mean that there's not a great future ahead. It just reminds me of Moses, and how, you know, he had all these apprehensions about trusting God. Well, not apprehensions about trusting God, but apprehensions about doing what God had said, and all of these things. And there has to be this continual trust. Like you said, that continual trust on relying that, okay, God, I'm going to believe that you are good and faithful in this, even if I can't see it yet, even if I don't understand.
Natural. Despite what we're seeing in the natural.
Yeah.
He's at work in the supernatural.
Yeah. And I think I'm humbled time and time again that just when I think I've gone, Lord, I've gotcha, this is too bad, this is too hard, this is too problematic, he goes, okay, well, let me show you what's good about this, you know? Even just thinking about COVID and all those sorts of things, like just thinking about where I am today and in my workplace and in my career, I've never known exactly where I was going to go, but knowing when you're called to something and knowing that I'm called to this place, I would have never, like you said in yesterday's episode, I would have never got to where I am today if I didn't have difficult circumstances along the way.
Exactly.
And you just see God pulling out these beautiful fruits.
This verse in particular was one of my core scriptures when I first became a Christian. It was one that I held on to, and really one of my biggest prayers after the tragic death of my sister was that the darkness would not overcome the light, that somewhere that good would come from what had happened. And that was my prayer, constantly praying that evil would not have the final say, that love and redemption would win, and that God would, my heart was that God would use my suffering and everything that I'd learned through the death of my sister, that God would use that for good.
Yeah.
You know, that there was a purpose for that pain, and that there was, meaning somehow. I was just looking for that meaning, and God did not disappoint. He answered every prayer plus more. Like, it's just astounded me that nothing has been wasted. He's used every single bit of every experience really over my life, including the death of my sister, to use for the good of others. And he's used me as a vessel for ministry. And I could not believe it when I got my first call. When I had a first calling as a Christian, I kept getting this message from God: I'm calling you to become a funeral celebrant. And I'm like, what? This can't be.
Were you pushing back? Were you like, no, Lord, that's not for me?
I definitely was pushing back, because I had already told God that was it. I was done with death. I'd lost my sister. That was a traumatic death. That was huge. That meant I'd met my
no more.
Yeah, I'd met my quota.
You're like, Lord, you know this already.
I've had this horrendous experience. That's it. I'm not doing death ever again. I'm not doing a funeral anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I can imagine God up in heaven just having a chuckle. Wow, actually, Kylie, little do you know that your first call is going to be a funeral celebrant. So it actually, I have to confess, it took me a while to step out, and I didn't even know what that would look like. Like, okay, God's called me to be a funeral celebrant, but where do I start? And so then I eventually had the prompting to go and knock on the door of a funeral parlour. the funeral parlour that actually handled my sister's funeral.
Wow.
So he knew me, and so I knocked on the door and I just said, Bob, I want to become a funeral celebrant. I'm being called to be a funeral celebrant. And he said, well, what makes you think that you'd be any good as being a funeral celebrant? And I said, well, all I know is that I have a heart for people in grief, that God is telling me to become a funeral celebrant, and I love English. I've done English, as part of my teaching. I'd be good at writing eulogies, and I just have a heart for people in grief. I want to minister to people in grief, And he's like, well, Kylie, this is very opportunistic that you've come today, because our full-time celebrant has gone on leave. So he gave me a go. And
that
the door
is crazy.
How crazy is that? The door's just opened, and so all of a sudden I'm using my own experience, all my experiences, everything the Lord taught me through my own grief and my passion to do beautiful services for people. So that was my first calling.
Wow.
Yeah.
Isn't that incredible?
So it was really incredible. And, it didn't stop there. He did actually then lead me into ministry, and I've been able to use, and become a chaplain. So I've been able to minister as a chaplain, obviously. And he's also used me out in the prison ministry at the women's prison. And I've actually been able to speak to, a lot of women, and they've got all different layers of grief out there. So sharing my testimony out at the prison has been pretty, and also alongside other victims of crime within the court support network as well. So beautiful. My encouragement would really be to people out there for this verse: God redeems everything, and God does have a plan and a purpose for the pain. And I've seen it time and time again. It never ceases to amaze me. His heart to redeem and to use every situation so that we can minister to others. And it's the thing I'm most passionate about, about serving the Lord, is for everything that we learn, it's for somebody else's breakthrough.
So beautiful, Kylie. I love that. For everything that we go through and that we learn, it's for someone else. And that's how the Lord leads us into those good plans that he talks about in these verses.
So good.
That those plans to prosper us and not to harm us, that there's plans for a hope and a future. And, maybe today you're feeling what we were talking about before. Maybe you feel like every time you step out into something, every time you think you're going into what God's called you to, maybe it feels hard, maybe it feels difficult, maybe you feel intimidated and embarrassed or fearful of what it is. But just know that God's plans for you are good. His plans for you, like this verse says, are to give you a hope and a future. So whether it's fear and intimidation, or whether it's not knowing how to go from where God's taken you into what he's going to have for you, keep on trusting. It's the theme of our week. It's trust and it's hope. Keep on believing that he will break through, that he will lead you to a place of hope. And he has a beautiful future ahead of you. So next time you're feeling nervous or intimidated, just remember this verse, Jeremiah 29:11, because the Lord has great plans for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. I cannot wait to unpack this even more on tomorrow's episode of the Everyday Joy podcast. Until then, I pray you're able to find moments of joy.